VikesNow, I'm Dustin Baker. This is the February 27th edition. We're kicking off the NFL Combine Week. That's another big plank in the offseason. And they won't do anything today in terms of stuff you can watch for highlights or on NFL Network. That stuff begins on Thursday. Today's just the interview stuff. But because it is Combine Week, I've decided to highlight 5 players, in my opinion, that you should be watching for Vikings draft purposes. Now, these aren't the only guys. You can watch hundreds, and I expect you to do so. But these are gentlemen who have been in the Vikings orbit in the last 6 weeks or so, from folks' mock drafts, according to roster need, best player available. And again, there's more than 5, but these are 5 that I'm going to highlight because I feel like they could realistically end up on the Vikings roster, whether it's at the 23 pick or in one or two circumstances, a trade down the board, which I fully expect still to happen. And this is what the rest of the world is saying too. All of these gentlemen that I am about to lift up for you guys and gals have been credibly linked to the Vikings. And again, that's probably because of the roster needs at the moment, plus the philosophy of best player available. You can marry both worlds at the 23rd pick, which the Vikings have, or in some circumstances, even if they trade back to accumulate more draft capital. So the team has 4 picks as of right now that should spike to 5 with a compensatory pick for Tyler Conklin. Vikings should get a 5th rounder for him, his free agency, when he walked to the Jets last year. So it'll probably be 5, and I fully predict that number of guys that's ultimately drafted will climb to 7, 8, 9, 10, because your favorite team employs a general manager who fiendishly trades. And it makes this time of year very fun, especially those 3 days of the NFL draft. But no further ado, let's start doing this. Again, the criteria is that these guys have been somewhat linked to the Vikings already, and therefore you should start keeping tabs on them. The first one is a wide receiver, and you love it because I think every Vikings fan on earth enjoys drafting wide receivers, especially with high round draft capital. Not just because, but the team has a glorious history on drafting wide receivers. There are some bad ones that didn't pan out, like Laquan Treadmill. I get it. Cordero Patterson wasn't a slam dunk pick, but he's probably going to be a Hall of Famer for return purposes, and he turned into a running back. So I still give the Vikings management props for drafting Patterson. They just didn't use him correctly. All right, I digress. Jordan Addison is the first one from USC. This guy is 6 feet, 175 pounds, so he's kind of what I'd call the new build of wide receiver. I think a person of that stature 20 years ago would have been like, what are we doing here, man? Are you a returner? But no, that's kind of a trend. It really doesn't matter your height and weight as a wide receiver anymore. The era of salivating over the big, tall wide receivers like Randy Moss or Alvin Harper. No, don't do that anymore. It's everybody gets to play. At least in terms of how you build out a roster. Jordan Addison, he is one that I think that you should start to watch because he could reasonably be there at number 23 for the Vikings. He has the draft stock to marry best player available, and I'm assuming Adam Thielen doesn't return, he still could. The Vikings probably need to get richer at WR2 to offset those games where Justin Jefferson's bottled up. So Jordan Addison in 2021 had 1,593 receiving yards and 17 touchdowns. And the next year, 875 yards and 8 touchdowns at USC. I think that 2021 season was at University of Pittsburgh, if I'm not mistaken. So he's got the numbers to back it up. He kind of has that Devonta Smith pro comp. So Jefferson takes care of most of the heavy lifting, and then in those certain games where, teams sell out to neutralize him, then you'd have Addison on the outside. But Addison is a guy with this combine coming up, and then the subsequent 2 months we have before the NFL draft. His stock could climb, could stay right where it is, or be available for number 23 at the Vikings. But if you subscribe to the theory that the Vikings should get younger, cheaper, and better at WR2, Addison could be the guy, so keep an eye on his draft combine and what comes of it. The next one is probably my personal favorite on the list. I've spoiled this already by teasing my affinity for what could be, and it's Brian Bresee from Clemson. He is an interior defensive lineman, and the reason that I would enjoy Kwesi Adofo-Mensah selecting him is ever since Sharif Floyd, the Vikings have been done drafting defensive linemen with early round draft capital. Hell, they haven't drafted an edge rusher since 2005 in round 1 or round 2 for that matter. There's just this large drought. Thankfully for their sake, they've hit on Everson Griffin, Danielle Hunter, Brian Robeson, traded for Jared Allen. So it worked out in the defensive trenches. But I don't like going into September trying to predict the roster, the depth chart, and then the depth chart comes out and it's Jonathan Bullard at Breese's spot. Or, hey gang, we're going with Shamar Stephen. Some years they've tried Shelvin Richardson, which was more exciting than the other guys I just mentioned. Armin Watts in 2021. I don't want to do that anymore. I don't want to rely on Danielle Hunter and Zadarius Smith or whoever replaces Zadarius Smith to inspire all of the pass rush. I think we should get with the times and do some of that from the inside of the line. Now, hopefully Dalvin Tomlinson's back and he can do a little bit of that too, but Bresee is a bona fide pass rusher that you could employ on the inside of the defensive line in addition to these monster of rock type of Danielle Hunter and Zadarius Smith guys and whoever it may be in the future. So and the knock on Bresee is that he's only played, I think he's played less than 400 defensive snaps in the last 2 years. So yes, I know it's the injury thing, and you're probably a little scarred from that from Lewis C. and Andrew Booth, rightfully so. But in terms of talent, if Brian Breese's there, this guy will endorse it. Although for the second time this show, I do not expect the Vikings to pick at number 23. I think they'll trade back. Number 3 is a teammate of Bresee, Trenton Simpson, and Josh Fry, who's on this show every Wednesday, continues to pound the table for Simpson because he calls him the most game-ready off-ball linebacker in this draft class. And bada bing, how did the Vikings flounder on defense last year? Well, they had old off-ball linebackers that didn't look quite as crisp as they used to, especially Eric Kendricks. Now, we shall see how much Brian Flores, who was, checks notes, a linebackers coach for the Pittsburgh Steelers last year, rectifies the off-ball linebacker room. Brian Asamoah's chilling. He's probably ready to make the starting jump. It would be weird if he didn't. But next to him, who's it going to be? Is it going to be a free agent like David Long from the Titans or Tremaine Edmonds from the Bills? Is it going to be just Kendricks coming back again and hoping last year was just weird? Or could it be somebody like Trenton Simpson? The other interesting thing on Simpson is, theoretically, if I'm right and Kwesi Adofo-Mensah trades back, Simpson isn't a guaranteed first rounder because off-ball linebackers are not considered premium positions, I guess, anymore, or I don't at all, ever, maybe. I think they used to be when running the football was more trendy. But Simpson, let's say the Vikings finagle a deal to trade their 23rd pick for the 35th and a third rounder or something like that. Then Simpson could still be in play, and let's face it, if you assume Hicks will not be back, which I don't think he will, and perhaps Kendrick's gone too, well, the linebackers coach, Brian Flores, who's the new defensive coordinator, will want some good linebackers, and Simpson might be too irresistible to pass up. So he'll be at the combine. Keep an eye on him. Second to last, I put on here because cornerback is a position of need, whether you like it or not. For now, it is Andrew Booth, Cameron Dantzler, and Caleb Evans as the startable, playable CBs on the roster. And therefore, if I have no idea how they feel about Andrew Booth internally, if they think that he's a bust, then you have to get ready for the future. Because if we've learned anything in the pass-happy NFL in the last, 5-10 years since the Denver Broncos and Peyton Manning fundamentally changed how the game was played by passing it all the time, it's that you can't go into a season, expect to push for the playoffs, get to the Super Bowl with half-ass cornerbacks. You've got to have good ones, and as Mike Zimmer always said, they get hurt. You got to have good depth too. So right now, the Vikings have some interesting depth, young cornerbacks with the possibility of re-signing Patrick Peterson and Duke Shelley. But Cam Smith, in my opinion, is the most mock-drafted cornerback to the Vikings in the last 2 months or whenever you think mock drafts began. I think Cam Smith from South Carolina is the most popular candidate to end up with the Vikings per credible mock drafts. Now, every person in the world has their own mock draft and they somehow publish it to the internet. But I'm talking like, Todd McShay's and those guys. I think Cam Smith right now would be the consensus pick if drafts were decided by mock drafts, which they are not. He's 6 feet, 190 pounds. His weakness is considered not the best tackler and gets a little over aggressive at times. But in most simulations, he's thereabouts at number 23. So if we're going to do this cornerback thing again in the first round of the draft, Cam Smith seems like a wise decision per availability and then, his upside. And again, he's from South Carolina and hopefully could start day one. Finally, number 5. This is the one the fans want. I put a unscientific poll out on Twitter. I think the group, the body politic of Vikings fans is warming up to the idea of drafting a wide receiver in the first round. So I asked them, out of the 4 options that I considered had some realism, who they'd want to draft, and it was the Jackson Smith. I'm not going to butcher his last name. JSN from Ohio State. I got to learn how to pronounce that last name so I don't disrespect the man. But yeah, you know who I'm talking about. He is 6 foot, 198 pounds, so a little thicker than Addison. His pro comp is Robert Woods, who's interestingly a free agent, who some folks believe could play WR2 for the Vikings because of his Kevin O'Connell connection. I'm not one of those dudes. I don't want another 31-year-old playing WR2. I'd rather have a young guy like this one, Jackson Smith from Ohio State. In 2021, so 2 years ago, Smith fired up 1,606 receiving yards, 9 touchdowns for Ohio State. Last year, I think he dealt with injuries because the stat line was not quite as sexy as before, but that's a good way to have him available to the Vikings at number 23. But yeah, we see that the production was there, assuming his health is good to go. He's at the combine. So the 2 wide receivers, Addison and Jackson Smith from Ohio State. I think those guys, they could be talked into the top 15 in the next 2 months. But I think those are your options. So it's Jordan Addison, USC wide receiver, Brian Breesy, defensive tackle, Clemson, Trenton Simpson, off-ball linebacker, Clemson. Is it Simpson from Clemson? That rhymed. Cam Smith, cornerback, South Carolina, and Jackson Smith from Ohio State. And I promise I'll figure out how to pronounce that last name. I think I know how to say it, but I don't want to screw it up after how many times what was the one I struggled with last year? Kanane Nwangu I finally got, but that was thanks to weeks worth of practice. So NFL Combine, a lot of it should be on NFL Network, and you'll hear chirping about it all week. It's always a blast of a week because it symbolizes the informal beginning to the offseason. And again, 2 weeks from right now, free agency begin. And I will attest that is the largest beginning of the offseason puzzle, because you can start to examine where the team wants to go by who it doesn't resign, who it signs on the open market, and which internal free agents they bring back. All right, I'll be back tomorrow to talk more Viking stuff. Skol, baby.